Every single time the gun conversation enters the national spotlight, the same thing happens. The same talking points, the same proposals, the same emotional reaction on both sides. And lost somewhere in the middle of it all, the actual facts about what gun control looks like in America right now, what's already on the books, what's being proposed, and how it all affects the person standing at the counter trying to make an informed legal purchase. That's the part that never gets covered well, because the conversation is always framed as a fight. It's framed as pro-gun versus anti-gun, as if those are the only two positions that exist. And in that framing, the nuance disappears, the details disappear, and the people who are most affected, lawful firearms owners, new buyers, dealers, and the communities that depend on an informed citizenry, are left navigating a landscape that the loudest voices on either side have no interest in accurately describing. So let's do something different. Let's talk about what gun control actually is, what it already does, what it doesn't do, and what every firearms owner needs to understand about the regulatory framework they're already operating inside of, whether they realize it or not. Hi, I'm Etch, and welcome to another edition of the Redland Standard. Here's where we need to start. There is no single thing called gun control. That phrase is a container, a political shorthand that holds dozens of different policy proposals, existing laws, regulatory framework, and enforcement mechanisms, many of which have nothing to do with each other. When someone says I support gun control or I oppose gun control, they almost certainly are talking about different things than the person that they are arguing with. And that differential confusion is the root of almost every unproductive conversation on the topic. So let's actually define what exists right now. Right now in the United States, firearms purchases from a licensed dealer require a federal background check through the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or NICS. This has been the law since the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993. Every single person who buys a firearm from a federally licensed dealer undergoes this check. It screens for felony convictions, domestic violence misdemeanors, involuntary mental health commitments, dishonorable military discharge, active restraining orders, and several other disqualifying criteria. That system processed over 28 million checks in a recent calendar year. It is not an option. It is not a suggestion. It is federal law, and it has been for over 30 years. On top of that, the National Firearms Act, which we've talked about before on this channel, regulates additional categories of items: suppressors, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, machine guns, destructive devices, and any other weapon as classified by the ATF. These items require additional paperwork, additional background screening, registration in a federal database, and, until recently, a $200 tax stamp. The NFA has been in effect since 1934. That's 90 plus years of continuous regulation on specific categories of firearms and accessories. Then you have the Gun Control Act of 1968, which established the Federal Firearms License System, the FFL, and created a legal infrastructure for who can sell firearms commercially, how those sales are recorded, and what reporting obligations exist. It also restricted the importation of firearms not meeting the sporting purposes criteria and established categories of prohibited persons. Then you have state-level legislation, which varies so drastically from state to state that calling it a patchwork is generous at best. It's more like 50 separate legal ecosystems, each with their own purchase requirements, carry laws, waiting periods, or lack thereof, permit structures, magazine capacity limits, assault weapons definitions, or complete absence of those definitions, and reciprocity agreements that may or may not recognize your neighboring state's permits. I'm walking through all of this not to give a civics lesson, but to make a point that most people on both sides of this debate don't fully appreciate. America already has gun control, and lots of it. Layers of it. Federal, state, local. The question has never really been, should there be gun control? Because there is. The question is the existing framework effective? And if not, what specifically should change? And that's where the conversation goes sideways, because the proposals you hear in the news rarely reference existing framework. They're almost always framed as if nothing exists, as if there are no background checks, as if anyone can buy a machine gun at a gas station, as if the NFA doesn't exist, the GCA doesn't exist, NICS doesn't exist, and we're operating in some kind of regulatory vacuum. That framing is not accurate, and it leads to policy proposals that either duplicate what already exists, conflict with what already exists, or target populations that are already the most compliant. That's the part that matters to you as the firearms owner, because you are the most regulated participant in the entire ecosystem. Every legal purchase you make is documented. Every NFA item you own is registered. Every carry permit you hold required a background check. And in many states, training verification and fingerprinting. You are not the unregulated actor in this story. You are the most regulated actor. And the proposals that tend to gain political traction almost always add more friction to your life while doing very little to address the people who are already ignoring the existing laws. Now, and this is important, this is not an argument against all future regulation. It is an observation about how the current conversation is structured. There is a legitimate good faith conversation to be had about whether the existing background check system is catching everyone it should. There's a real conversation about whether NICS has the data it needs from every state, because historically it hasn't, and that's led to real failures. There's a real conversation about enforcement priorities and whether the existing laws are being prosecuted effectively. Those are important questions, and they deserve serious, non-performative answers. What doesn't serve anyone is the cycle we've been trapped in for decades. A high-profile event occurs, emotional proposals are introduced within days. Those proposals are either blocked or passed along party lines with minimal examination. The news cycle moves on, and nothing structurally changes in the enforcement of existing laws. That cycle has repeated so many times, it's become the default operating mode of the gun control conversation. And both sides are exhausted by it, for different reasons, but equally exhausted. What's actually changing right now, in a way that most people aren't tracking, is happening at the state level. And it's moving fast. States are diverging dramatically. You have states like Texas, Florida, and Georgia that have moved towards constitutional carry, permitless carry for legal gun owners, while simultaneously loosening restrictions on NFA items and suppressor ownership. And you have states like California, New York, Illinois, and New Jersey that are moving in the opposite direction, adding purchasing restrictions, expanding assault weapons definitions, limiting magazine capacity, and creating regulatory structure that make legal ownership progressively more complex. That divergence is creating two Americas when it comes to firearms ownership, and it is affecting buyers directly every single day. If you're buying a rifle at Redland Rifle Company or any reputable dealer, the configuration that's legal in one state might be a felony in another. Not a misdemeanor, a felony. The exact same firearm, the exact same buyer, the exact same intent. And the legal outcome depends entirely on which side of the state line you're standing on. That's not hypothetical. That's the current reality, and it's getting more complex, not less. What has not changed, and this is the counterbalance, is the constitutional framework. The Second Amendment still exists. The Heller decision from 2008 still affirmed an individual right to keep and bear arms. The Bruen decision from 2022 reshaped how courts evaluate firearm regulation by requiring them to be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearms regulation. That Bruen framework is still being litigated in courts across the country, actively right now, and it's producing results that cut in both directions. Some regulations are being struck down, others are being upheld. The legal landscape is in flux in ways that we haven't been in decades. And for the informed firearms owner, that flux matters, because the laws you comply with today may not be the laws you comply with next year in either direction. Your state could loosen restrictions or tighten them. Your carry permit could gain reciprocity in some states and lose it in others. The firearm you legally purchased and configured could become subject to new registration requirements or feature restrictions, depending on where legislative momentum carries your jurisdiction. That brings us to the midpoint insight that I think defines this entire conversation. The gun control debate in America is not a debate about whether regulation should exist. It exists extensively. The real debate, the one that actually matters, is about who bears the cost of new regulation. And right now, overwhelmingly, the answer is the people who are already following the law. That's not a partisan statement. That's a structural observation. When the new restriction is introduced, a waiting period, a feature ban, a capacity limit, a registration requirement, it is enforced at the point of legal sale. It is enforced at the dealer counter. It's enforced against the person filling out the 4473, the person submitting to the background check, the person presenting their ID, the person following every step of the existing process. That person absorbs the new friction, the additional paperwork, the additional weight, the additional cost, the additional complexity. The person who acquires a firearm outside of that system, through theft, through straw purchase, through black market transactions, through any of the channels that already violate the existing federal law, is unaffected. They're already ignoring the rule. Adding another rule to the stack they're ignoring does not change their behavior. It changes yours. And that asymmetry is the core frustration of the informed firearm owner. Not anger, not defiance, frustration. Because you're watching a system that already requires significant compliance from you get more complex, while the enforcement mechanism of existing violations remains under-resourced and under-prioritized. Let me give you a concrete example. Lying on a Form 4473, the Federal Firearms Transaction Record, is a felony. Checking no to a question about felony convictions when you are in fact a convicted felon is a crime, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. It's a clear, provable, binary violation. You lied on a federal form and the dealer has the paper to prove it. How many of those cases are actually prosecuted? The numbers are staggeringly low. We're talking about thousands of denied transactions where the buyer was caught lying, and a tiny fraction resulting in federal prosecution. That's not a gun control failure. That's an enforcement failure. And it's been documented by the Department of Justice's own Office of the Inspector General. The system catches people. The system does very little with them. And the people calling for new laws rarely address why the existing laws aren't being enforced before stacking new ones on top. Now let me talk about something every gun owner should understand, but very few actually do. The practical impact of regulatory uncertainty on purchasing behavior. Because this is where the gun control conversation leaves the political arena and enters your life directly. Every time a major gun control proposal gains traction, an assault weapons ban, a magazine capacity restriction, a new registration requirement, purchasing behavior spikes. You've seen it, I've seen it. The team at Redland Rifle Company has lived through multiple cycles of it. ARs fly off the shelf, standard capacity magazines sell out overnight, ammunition prices surge. And it happens not because people are panicking, although some are, but because rational actors respond to the possibility of reduced future access by securing access now. That buying surge creates its own set of problems. Prices inflate, inventory distorts, first-time buyers get pressured into purchases they haven't fully researched because they're afraid the option won't exist next month. And the market doesn't normalize until the legislative threat passes or is enacted. Either way, the consumer pays. The informed buyer is disadvantaged by the urgency, and the retailer spends months correcting the inventory imbalances that weren't driven by organic demand, but by regulatory fear. Think about someone buying their first firearm right now. They've made the decision for home defense, for personal protection, for whatever reason. That's theirs and theirs alone. They walk into a shop and they're carrying with them every impression they've absorbed from news coverage, social media, political arguments, and cultural narratives about firearms. Many of those impressions are inaccurate. They expect it to be easy because the narrative says it's too easy. And then they encounter the 4473. the NICS check, the state-specific requirements, the waiting period, if applicable, the identification requirements, the questions about mental health history, drug use, domestic violence, and citizenship status. And they realize, often for the first time, that the process is significantly more involved than they were told. This is why education matters more than argument. This is why channels like this one exist. Not to score political points, not to trigger reactions, not to treat the gun control conversation as content fodder, but to give people, whether they own firearms or not, an accurate picture of what actually exists, how it actually works, and what any proposed change would actually affect. The most dangerous thing in the gun control conversation isn't a legislative proposal. It's the ignorance of the system the proposal is supposed to improve. You cannot improve something you don't understand. And right now, the loudest voices in the debate on both sides consistently demonstrate that they don't understand the system they're trying to change or preserve. I watch this from behind the counter at places like Redland Rifle Company. I watch it from the buyer's side. I watch it from the content side. And what I see over and over is a gap. A gap between what people believe the law does and what the law actually does. A gap between what's proposed and what would actually work. A gap between the narrative and the reality. And every person who closes that gap by reading the law, by understanding the process, and by experiencing it firsthand, becomes a more effective participant in the conversation, regardless of where they land politically. And that brings me to where I want to leave this. The gun control conversation is not going away. It's not going to be solved by one election, one bill, one court decision, or one viral moment. It's a permanent feature of American civic life. And the way you participate in it matters. If you participate with slogans, you're noise. If you participate with anger, you're fuel for the other side's narrative. If you participate with information, with an understanding of what exists, what works, what doesn't, and what any proposed change would actually do, you are the most valuable person in the room. That's what I want for the people who watch this channel. Not agreement, not loyalty to a position, understanding. Because understanding is the only thing that survives any news cycle. And it's the only thing that changes the conversation for the better. I'm Etch. This has been the Redland Standard, and I'll see you in the next one.